to you. Sometimes we say things to you that you probably don't appreciate, but I want you to know that for all of us that came along in the time of real crisis when the media wasn't doing the right thing, we appreciate what you do. So thank you very much. There's a lot to be said by having a media group that covers local issues in depth that makes a real difference. So thank you very much. But that play Ain't Misbehaving, I think you guys ought to watch it, a little bit. So let's see. Today we're going to do a couple of things that are very important. They're a lot more around our internal work and our efforts that we're trying to accomplish. We are going to go back and revisit what I think are our priorities, and I may get out here on the 3-meter board at the tip and say I think that what we talked about reaffirms what we're committed to, which is basically creating a livable city for people where they can work and live and move about for work and family. So that's, I think we're close there, but there are a number of things that we have many people working to accomplish. We're very fortunate that while we have much work to do on citizen engagement, we have a lot of citizens that are engaged. And I would hope that we would have the opportunity to talk about some of those, and that's why Tracy is teed up for us to talk about some projects that are going on before we go into closed session around some project issues that meet the closed session requirements, as well as a closed session for assessment of the city manager. And at the end of that, we'll probably have, well, I know likely we will have some statement that we can make if you guys want to just have Jason email it to you on the manager's evaluation, or if you want to stay for that and have interviews or whatever after. You guys decide that. So we'll be doing that today. So 4 things to accomplish. An overview of some big projects first. Kelly's hospitality, 4 things. Hospitality is going to go first. Hospitality financing model will go first. Tracy's going to go with big projects. We're going to talk about a few projects. I wanted Malcolm to give you some updates on the work around Brook Hill and a few things like that. So then we'll go into closed session and call it a day. So thank you guys for the attention that's been paid to this effort. And I think we've had 2 really good days of discussion about big things, and now we're going to go kind of into some of the implementation that's going on and the thoughts and plans around implementation for some of those strategies. So with that, Mr. Jones, you want to introduce Kelly?
So thank you, Mayor. We will have our CFO, Kelly Flannery, to give the council and all who are viewing an update on how we're addressing our hospitality funds. I think it's extremely important that we level set today because there's some projects that are in the near term and in the long term, and there have been some, I would say, maybe misunderstanding of how the hospitality funds are used and what their purpose, the purpose for the fund. So Kelly will guide us through that discussion, and then we'll have Tracy Dotson discuss a number of the projects that are related to hospitality.
Thank you, Manager Jones. I have some sad news. It's not so much an update as a repeat as what I presented to you in November, so please manage expectations. You're not going to see anything new. I did incorporate some transitional slides, so we're going to go over today an overview of what affordability analyses are, the permissible uses of tourism revenues, sources and uses, considerations, affordability, and some key takeaways as Tracy goes into this, what are we calling, specialty projects. So first,
I know if you can speak a little bit, pull the mic up closer, or yeah, it's hard.
is this better? Is this better? Thank you. Thank you, Councilman. So when we look at affordability analysis, well, let's back up. So when we fund capital, we use long-term debt, and that's typically in the forms of bonds or certificates of participation. And this is across all funds, all capital. The reason we do that is so that we can spread the cost of the project out across the useful life of the asset. So when we do that, we want to make sure we can afford it. And so for that purpose, we do an affordability analysis. We don't fund operations with bonds or CO, I'm just going to call them COPs, certificates of participation. Are we okay? Okay. Not operations, just long-term capital. And because of our stellar ratings, we enjoy really low rates of borrowing, so bonds are our friends in this case. So what is an affordability analysis? It's a plan that projects future revenues and expenses and contemplates the ability to pay. And I want to stress ability to pay, not capacity to pay. For me, capacity is the C word. It's not a word we should use. Capacity is, can you pay? Affordability is, should you pay? We need to start having that conversation. Not can we get it, but should we have it? So why do we do affordability analysis? To provide assurance that whatever we are funding we can afford and is cost effective, that we have a balance between the needs of the city and our ability to pay for them, and to maintain strong financial management. The city enjoys AAA ratings. The airport is the highest rated of any major airport in the United States. Those ratings are not accidents. It is the work of you guys that have made that happen. While the state mandates an 8% fund balance reserve, we mandate 16%. We have metrics far in excess of what rating agencies require to maintain our ratings. And for that, we've been rewarded with high ratings. If we start making decisions based on capacity rather than affordability, we send a message to the rating agencies that we're not good decision makers. And that's a metric when they're measuring our rating. So it's very important that we continue to have a conversation around affordability rather than capacity. And we do this for every credit for the city: transit, airport, water, sewer, tourism, geo, everything. And we update it all year long. So let's talk about tourism. Good luck if you can read this, but like I said, you've all already seen this before. Tourism revenues per state legislation can only be used for these purposes. They can't be used to fund public safety. They can't be used at the airport. They can't be used at water, only for these purposes. And some of them are redundant. Tourism sometimes can be used for convention and vice versa. But this is primarily your occupancy tax, which is 8%. There's a 3%, a 3%, and a 2%, and food and beverage. So when you look at the convention center, obviously it includes convention center, as well as Bank of America Stadium. This would be where soccer would live, as well as amateur sports. Currently, we're paying debt service on so debt service is repayment on bonds that are outstanding. For the convention center that we just approved in March and again in October, as well as the Bank of America Stadium. For tourism, we're paying the debt service on the Spectrum Center, as well as operating costs for Spectrum Center, a small subsidy, BB&T, and then the Hall of Fame is obviously all NASCAR related. So this slide here is exactly.
Kelly, just a question. So the right-hand column kind of implies that we use it for infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
But is that true?
No, so you'll see where it says Spectrum Center capital improvements and capital reserves, annual arts and cultural facility maintenance. Those are more the annual operating costs of the facilities. So we pay.
Okay, but could they be used, because there it says programs. So it could be used for programming?
Indeed, yes.
Okay.
So and it is. So there's a portion, and we'll get into it, but there's a portion that goes to CRVA, and they use that for, they have, and I don't remember the name of it, Choose Charlotte, or whatever the program is. They use that to encourage hospitality and tourism within the city. So it's not all facilities, it is programming.
Kelly,
Yes?
these are given to us by authority from the state. Is there a time limit on the particular authority that we have for each of these buckets?
Yeah, and we'll go through them, but I can skip ahead.
Okay, yeah.
So for the, I'm not going to skip ahead. We'll get to them when we get to them naturally.
Okay.
Is there any other questions on this slide? This slide is a graphical representation of what's in the 2020 budget. This is what you approved in the budget for each of those 3 funds. So these are, again, I think the budget director spoke about it yesterday. These are special revenue funds. This is not the general fund. These, again, our purposes can only be hospitality and tourism. So as I mentioned in the convention center fund, it's primarily 3% occupancy tax and food and beverage. The occupancy tax, no, the food and beverage tax expires 7/1/34 on this fund, and you'll see it again in a couple slides. And then the uses are really 2 things. It's debt service and operations. And then the tourism fund, it's primarily occupancy tax and rental car tax. And on NASCAR, it's just the 2% occupancy tax that was created specifically for NASCAR. And if you want more detail on the purposes, it's in more words in the budget, but we can go through any of it now if you'd like. Good. So what drives the tourism affordability analysis? The existing cost. So we have costs that we know. Payments on existing debt. Like I said, we have Bank of America debt outstanding, Spectrum Center, Convention Center. Well, we borrow debt at a fixed rate. The payments aren't uniform every year. We didn't borrow all the debt on the same day. We don't repay it on the same schedule. So we have to look at what each year's payment is. The operating and maintenance of facilities. We can assume a 3% increase in those costs every year, but we look at it every year to see, are there special projects? Are there facilities that need an amount greater than that? And then revenue trends. In August of 2020, we're going to have probably every hotel room in the county full. That's a one-time anomaly. That's not something that we're going to put into our projections, but it is something that's going to change how that budget looks. So when you approve the 2021 budget, you probably are going to see an occupancy tax revenue expectation in excess of what we will see in 2022. But we're cognizant of that as we're updating the models. When we're looking about contemplating new projects, again, we look at the revenue trends, but we also have to look at what's going on in the market. So while we enjoy historically low interest rates, how long is that going to last for? We heard Vintner say it's going to last a little bit longer than we had originally projected. But are we going to have market access? Because we are a AAA, it's pretty easy for us to sell debt. But also because of the whole global climate, interest rates are low everywhere. So investors are more risky than they were before. Is it going to be harder to sell our debt? No, but it might cost us a couple basis points. So we have to factor that in our model. Additionally, project timing. You'll see on the next page on the model how things can move if we delay a project. Fund balance is really our most critical metric. If we delay a project, that number just keeps growing. So while you might hate a delay, I love a delay because it means more money for us. And then we have instituted draw programs. I think what we saw historically is sometimes we borrow money and projects get delayed. So what we've done now is we take out short-term borrowing programs to fund the actual construction. Upon completion, we then take it out with debt. That's allowed us, because the short-term borrowing is a lower interest rate, it's allowed us to delay the fixed rate for a greater period of time and have greater certainty on those costs going forward. Any questions here? Dimple has a question.
No. How does resiliency plans affect our, or drive up the cost for our, or maybe even go down? Like for an example, when we were going through the CF process, the strategic plan process, Dr. Carney, who was our consultant, he had mentioned having resiliency planning is so important that now a lot of debt issuance companies are looking at that to see how cities are preparing for natural disasters or having some sort of resiliency plans. So from your experience, how that has affected in the past and how would that affect moving forward?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't know if you saw, probably last month in your packets, I circulated a report that Moody's recently did about the 25 largest populated cities and our ability to weather a recession. And there were 25 cities. They ranked them overly prepared, moderately prepared, or danger zone. And there were 5 that were bring it on, and we were one of them. So I think we're in a really unique position, whatever the calamity is, if it's a recession, if it's a natural disaster, whatever it is, we're in really good shape.
So yes, from economic climate, but I'm also talking about it from climate in terms of what are we doing to prepare for natural disaster? What are our efforts in fighting the climate change? Not just from economic perspective, but also from the environmental perspective and how that affects our rating.
So I think there's opportunity, so it's not specific to tourism, I'm assuming your question is. If you're talking globally, what's the city doing?
No, not what is city doing. How does that affect, and would it have a financial impact?
So there are, on specific credits, on the water credit, on the stormwater credit, there is ability when we issue debt to certify our bonds as green. So that is something we can contemplate. The problem with that program is it's pretty new and they haven't really set out what the long-term guidelines will be. That's one way that we can mitigate economically against it. I don't know that there's anything specific to tourism or to the airport or to the general city's economics that mitigates against climate change.
Okay, so I'm going back to what our consultant, Dr. Carney, had said when we were going through resiliency planning from the environmental perspective, and how he had focused in his report the financial impact, and how that is an important piece when you go out to issue debt. So I think we should look at that, and whether, I know we are already AAA bond rated, and we are one of the, we are getting very competitive interest rate on our debt issuance. But I think we also should look at our planning that we are doing, resiliency planning overall as a city, and how that is overall preparing us for economically, but also environmentally, to withstand any natural disasters.
I will ask David to put that on the board, but in terms of this fund, that would not be connected at all. But we'll make sure we address your question as a follow-up.
Okay.
I think it's worth mentioning that the excess fund balance that we have can be regarded as kind of a cushion. So we have $100 and something million in fund balance. We're only required to maintain 50 or so. So that already represents some capacity to deal with irregularities. And the other thing worth noting is we went through the entire recession, this last big one, and the city had to make some operating adjustments and things like that, but didn't miss a debt payment and maintained its rating. So I think we are actually quite resilient. Obviously, there are Armageddon scenarios that it would be extravagant to try to fund for on a full-time basis. So I like where we are.
I do too, and I would just add that beyond the $100 million in these funds, there's balance in every one of our funds for just such an event.
That's the general fund,
yeah. But as it relates to fund balance, I don't know if I move forward, I do want to just highlight what the purpose of it and what it is, I guess. We'll start there. Fund balance is calculated annually. It is a look at a point in time. So for us, our calendar year ends June 30th. On June 30th, what do we have left for current year's liabilities after we've paid all of our bills? And that is the number that drives every model we do. Any questions on what fund balance is? So fund balance is really your balance in your checking account at the end of, once you've cleared all your bills at the end of every year.
Kelly, one thing, the CRVA obligations, debt obligations, are general obligations, right? They're not revenue bonds.
The CRVA doesn't actually have the authority to issue debt. The debt is the debt of the city. But they are certificates of participation that are collateralized with property. But at the end of the day, if we weren't able to make those payments, the full faith and credit of the city would have to cover it.
Right, so we are on the hook for those. Do we
Correct.
actually market them, though, as kind of cash flow supported? Like, do we identify to the investors that we have these revenue streams that are associated with those bonds?
In our offering statements, it says it is the city's intent to utilize the occupancy tax, and we go into the legislation, but in the fine print, it is any dollar of the city, and that is the same for transit as well. We obviously earmarked that half-cent for sales tax to transit bonds, but same party.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
All right, a lot of numbers, but you've seen them before. So, okay, great. So we heard Vintner say Monday, that the yield curve inversion was going to result in a recession in 18 months, but he didn't see it coming. So in July, everyone said it was coming. We're still saying it's coming, and if it doesn't come, that's excellent. But you'll note in 2020, 21, 22, moderate increases in revenue. Those tiny little increases, we're assuming no growth in revenue. That is just interest that will be earned on of our investments. So the dynamics of this model, and every model is dynamic, it is live, it moves every day. In May, when the budget is introduced, you'll likely see a revenue number higher than 62.4 million, because we know we're going to get the RNC, we know we're not going to experience negative growth or minimal growth. So when that number comes out, we will update this model again to reflect the actual, and then we will model off all the future years. Another note I want to highlight on the revenue side is and there was no magic between the 5-year spans, it was just a space issue. In 7/1/2034, which is on right here, you will note between 34 and 39 the decline in revenue projections, and that reflects your sunset of the food and beverage tax that you were asking about.
Does this account for a mild recession?
Yes, 2021, and 2022 assume no growth because we're assuming in a recession. And again, if that doesn't happen in 20, as we heard Vintner say it probably won't, we'll move it forward. And then when we look at expenditures, you kind of look at two buckets. Debt service, what is the existing debt we have outstanding, and what are the operating expenses? So the CRVA receives a portion of the proceeds that is not used for debt service. Right now it's about probably 65% debt service, 35%, 30%-ish to CRVA. Whatever's left over after their operations goes into fund balance. So what you will note that's interesting on the debt service side is between 2023 and 2024, the decline in debt service. And that's primarily because when we funded Bank of America stadium improvements, we scheduled the debt to the tether. So the tether expires in 2023. We didn't want to be paying debt on something that no longer existed. So you'll see it rolls off. And what that means is a huge increase in available fund balance. So this first two sets of boxes is a picture of where we are right now. This includes everything that council has approved to date and expected debt service. So you will see at the end of 2020, we expect a fund balance of $68.8 million in the convention center fund. So what does that mean? We have $68 million in our bank, but we self-restrict. We tell ourselves whatever the next year's debt service is, we're going to make sure we have it in a pot in case calamity unfurls. So even though we're assuming a recession, we still have to pay debt service. So you'll note that 27.1 here is next year's debt service payment. 27.8 here, the following year's debt service payment. We always restrict ourselves. So in reality, what we have available for future projects today in the convention center is $41.7 million. Cash. That doesn't mean we can only fund $41 million in projects. That means that is what is available each year to make a debt service payment. Does everyone understand that?
would it be possible for you to do my mortgage that way, please? Would you help me with that? I like that idea. You take 12 months of payments that you're going to make the next year, and you earn it and restrict it the year before.
Yeah, if you wanted to take the M off and pretend this is thousands instead of millions. Pretend that your annual salary is $62.2 million, or not million, take off the M. You make $62,000 a
You don't
year.
deal with the thousands very often.
Not even 60,000.
And you mean my escrow is actually twice as much as it should be? I'm liking this, Kelly.
So pretend you make $62,000 a year. Let's look at debt service as your costs of things that you don't pay off in a year. So that would probably be your mortgage and your car. Those are the things you have monthly payments on, but they're not due at the end. You're not paying it off in full at the end of every year. So you have $2 million. I'm going to stop saying million. $62,000. You have $37,000 in mortgage and car expense. You have $26.9 in cable, phone, whatever your monthly costs are. At the end of the day, you were short because you only collected 62 and you spent whatever that is, 64.6. But you decided you didn't want to cut cable. You liked everything you had because you knew you had a bank account that had a whole bunch of money in it, and you were okay tipping into that account. So that's what that 2.4 million is. In 2020, we expect to use 2.4 million of our existing 68.8 million of fund balance to make your payments. And then the next year, you didn't get a raise. You just made some money off your investment. I don't know what happened. I don't know if you weren't a good employee or what happened. But you paid a lot off of your mortgage. So your mortgage payment, you're now down to $27,000. I don't know what you bought, but you had a good year and you went and bought more stuff and you spent $29,000. But at the end of it, you still had 6.2. And what'd you do with that 6.2? You put it in the bank. So at the end of the day, you have $41,000 in a bank account. You have a lovely home. You have a lovely car. But you want a boat. Can you afford a boat? Well, the boat's $100,000. You only have $41,000. But you can afford the boat because you're not going to pay for it all at one time. So you have $41,000. You're going to the bank and you say, I have $41,000. Can I get a mortgage or a loan for a boat? Sure, you have plenty of money to make a monthly payment on a boat. And that's what the next example shows. If you had a $100 million project, how would that change your fund balance? And you will know what this model assumes. We talked about short-term interest rates. We will do a 2-year draw for the construction of a $100 million project. And then in 2023, we would take out that loan with fixed rate COPs for a period of probably 20 or 30 years. This model assumes short because we're super conservative. So this assumes 20-year debt. We'll likely do 30, but we're trying to be super conservative. And you'll see, even after the $100 million, because your mortgage payment's being paid off, your car payment, you're still paying that off as you go. You're just adding a boat payment. So you'll see your fund balance is actually going to grow over time. So you're at 44, 57. So I would say, in short, we can afford some stuff in the convention center fund. Yeah.
So,
You got Ed.
I had a question.
Yacht.
Okay.
So this is actually still a little difficult to interpret because what we really need to see is when you run this in such a way that you incur debt at a rate such that your fund balance is equal and you have no available balance each year. And that defines affordability.
That defines capacity, and that's where I'm challenged. That's where I don't want to send to rating agencies the message that we make decisions based on how much money we have and how can we spend it all.
So, but that is still a relevant boundary. And what I'm saying then is if you're making the distinction between affordability and capacity, how do you use this model and what criteria are you using for affordability to tell us this is how much? I mean, what this is saying right now, for example, is you could spend $20 million a year in cash going out to 2044 on average, which is not very much, and you'd be fine. If you didn't borrow anything, you could just spend it in cash and you'd get to 515 million at the end of 24 years or whatever. But the debt capacity thing means that in the background, there's actually another calculation going on, which is your ongoing debt balance and your ability to borrow new money still staying within some sort of a limit. So what is your definition of the limit that constitutes affordability, and what conclusion do you reach as to how much we can actually spend from this fund and still maintain affordability? Because I can't see that up there.
I'm comfortable with always spending the available fund balance number because we have restricted fund balance. So if you're looking for a number, I would always say, I'm comfortable saying you have $41.2 million in a given year to either pay debt service with,
That's what I just said.
operations, or whatever you prefer.
That's what I just said. I said, if you run this model in such a way that your available fund balance is 0 every year, and you meet your restricted fund balance needs, that defines the limit of affordability.
Well, the challenge is the restricted fund balance is going to change as this council decides to add on projects. So if you give me some guidance as to what your project priorities are, I can then model what that restricted fund balance number moves to. But I need
but
input.
I'm trying to get at it the other way around, which is this model enables you, and maybe we can talk offline, but this model enables you to find a solution such that the available fund balance is 0. It will tell you then how much you can borrow each year, and that would tell us how much we can plan to spend each year.
I understand what you're saying, but for the reasons, my concerns with rating agencies, and that being how we're going to explain to them we're making decisions based on how much money we can spend. And from Tracy's perspective, it's difficult for her to negotiate a deal when the other side knows how much money that we have.
All right, but it's difficult for us if we don't know how much money we have.
I have the number there. You have $41.2 million available in 2020.
But I don't know what capital projects I can schedule and how much money I can spend and when based on that line. I just can't tell.
Yeah.
I think
So-
Dimple was next, so I think this is an important conversation that they have raised for us.
So I agree. I do not know how much we can take out debt knowing the fund balance. I agree that we have 41.7 in cash balance at the end of 2020. But what does that afford me? Like how much debt can I issue with that fund balance? I think if we have that, we can make a decision, we can make better decisions. That's number one. Number two, I wanted to go back to 2034 revenue, and you had brought that up. So explain me again what is generating, or I guess why increase from 78.6 to 94.1? I didn't quite catch
So
that.
that goes from 2029 to 34. So that's just a 3% compounding increase over 5 years. The decline from 34 to 39 is because the food and beverage legislation sunsets in 2034. So absent any sort of state legislative action, we wouldn't charge and collect that fee anymore.
Got it. Thank you.
Other questions, comments, Julie?
Yeah, I've asked this before, but before you were here, Kelly, so I'd like to repeat it. You know,
Julie, can you go to the mic?
I said I just want to get your perspective on this, Kelly. It's great that we've doubled what our state requirement is in our reserve, and that should give everybody comfort. But there's also sort of a thought out there that cities that do use some of their reserves for productive reasons, say transportation investment, that the rating agencies view that as a good investment and would not ding us if we were to take it below, our arbitrary number of 16%. I mean, it's not arbitrary because that's our policy, but if the state requirement's 8% and we say, you know what, we really want to invest in transportation in our community, that's going to make us a more productive community, but we're going to have to go to 14%. What's your opinion on that?
My initial reaction to that and my exposure to rating agencies is they don't like non-recurring revenue. So one-time fixes, things like that, are something they're not appreciative of. That's why we set benchmarks for what our reserves are, and then we do use money beyond that. Ryan talked about yesterday the 1.5 million that we had in excess of what our requirements were. So we actually are doing that now, but if we started talking about using a portion of that 16, that's a different conversation. That's a change in policy, and that's going to be an explanation to the rating agencies as to why we would want to do that. And it wouldn't be something that they would want us to do a one-off for.
No, no, I mean, I think it, you know, well, to some extent, if you're building a transportation infrastructure, some of that is one-off until you start building revenue from that service. But, and not that it's going to offset it completely, but I don't know, I just think it's something that if we look forward and we're really talking about making some bold moves in transportation, we got to start talking about how we're going to pay for it and what it's going to cost.
Yeah, we can take another look at the 16% and see if that's the right metric, but it shouldn't be something that we arbitrarily or, you know, we want to fund this project, let's grab money out of it. It would be a long-term policy change.
Thank you.
Kelly, I want to marry Julie's comment and Ed's comment around this. And this helped me understand. When we're looking at the available fund balance, and I think Julie more applies to our general fund, but let's just take this one that's in front of us. We know that we can cover and have our payments for what exists. And what I think Ed is saying is it's all well and good to know what our available fund balance is, but that actually gets interpreted into how much are you willing to spend and what do you want to spend. And what Julie, I think, is saying is, but how do you apply real change that you want to make to that? So for this one, for example, if you're looking at this available fund balance, I think the second line would be, what are the costs of the projects that are being requested and asked for? And how do we assess when those are based on need, for many different reasons, for being competitive with other communities our size, whether it's maintenance versus new, whether all of those kinds of factors. And those are the kind of policy that we have to assess the capital need. And then you have to say, okay, we've identified this as a need, so how does that 41.7 interpret to what that cost is? And that's what I think that is a policy that we set. And there's a lot to be said about it, because in our case on this fund, we are the keepers of hospitality funds through a contract that we have with CRVA to expend them. So they bring to us what is the need in the industry to be competitive to whatever the criteria is. But we own this money, so what are we willing and comfortable to spend long term? So it requires both of us to be at the table. It's marrying available fund balance and knowing what you need from CRVA. Now, I also want to say, and I think this is something we have to be very careful of, CRVA is a board that we nominate and they manage and help with a whole staff of people to do that. But this is hospitality funding, and the people that made this possible for us to have this money are generally statewide hospitality influence interest groups. And they also want to have a hand in what we're saying and what we're doing. So there's how much, what are the project policy requirements to be assessed? After assessing them, how do we apply that to the funding? And maybe it happens sometimes and maybe it doesn't. And then, does that really meet the overall intent for us to govern this money consistently with what we have the authority to do for those interest groups and influencers? So I think both questions are valid. I think the question that we have to ask is, what is underneath the fund balance? What are the projects now? And I think that's what Tracy's going to try to get at. Is that right?
Yeah,
Marcus?
absolutely. I'd like to add to that is, I guess it was in September you were having the discussion about the convention center expansion. And Kelly came up to the lectern and talked about fund balance.
Is this where you apologize for
This is where
telling me I had
apologize
to?
to Ryan Kelly.
I appreciate this.
And what we're attempting to do today is put it out there and show you how this model works. It's everything the mayor said, and you have to add to it the timing of the projects. So if a project isn't coming online until 2026, we're not going to put it in 2020 because that's just not how. So it's the beginning of a new way of not only looking at our projects, that's what Tracy will do next, but also how do you plug that into the affordability?
And I'm going to add one other thing. Kelly, I don't believe that the rating agencies like for the use of non-recurring funds, but I also believe that they don't want you to have money in the bank and roads filled with potholes.
Yeah.
And so that's the question, and that's what I think we have to assess. Are there things that help us grow this, or things that we have to do to maintain our competitive? What is our criteria? And working with people that actually, I like to think that we're experts in a lot of things, but this hospitality industry requires a level of commitment and expertise across the state. And so I don't want us to have a convention center that nobody wants to book in and we have money in the bank to repair it. But at the same time, I don't want to have a convention center that recruits, that's sized to recruit things that we can't accommodate because of our hotels. It's writing some of that down as a policy that grows out of this funding scenario here. That's my suggestion, is that the real discussion here is what is your budget policy for assessment of needs in each of these three funds.
So Kelly, I just wanted to say, for one, I'm not criticizing your work. This is more than we've had in the past, and I appreciate it. My only point is I can feel an opportunity to get answers to questions that we've had for a long time on the basis of this if we go a step further. So maybe I'll talk to you offline, but in general, I think our responsibility to the taxpayers or even to the hospitality industry is to know when we make decisions about capital investments what the context is for that decision. So whether we borrow right up to the point where our available fund balance is zero every year and we've kind of taken the maximum debt that we, our model says we can service, or I just don't have context. So I get a proposal for Discovery Place or whatever, we're going to hear about a couple of them, I think, and I have no way of knowing how that affects my capacity to deal with other things that I know can happen in the future. And obviously looming out there in the distant future is the stadium, but there are other things too that have come up in conversations about CRVA. And on the basis of those numbers, as a finance guy, I can't reach any conclusions about what we can do or when we should do what. But I do appreciate the work. I want to be clear about that.
And I want to add something. I don't think this is an offline conversation, because it takes us as a group to move forward. And what I would say is that all of us need to understand it, equally level set. And so I would appreciate the idea that we share this information so that we all start in a place that we can understand what we're trying to accomplish. So I would actually say that if we're really going to dive into this after getting the information today, if a budget committee has a policy for how, or creates a policy of how do we assess these things, that's important for everybody to understand.
No, I would certainly, my goal is to get this information, make it available to everybody. It's just based on my background, my process for getting answers to these questions might not be familiar to everybody. So if we can do some work and come up with information we can share with council that, in my view, better enables us to analyze our capacity, I think that would be good for all of us. Because I would challenge anybody in the room here to look at that and say, okay, if I need X $100 million for such and such, looks good. Now, I know that we would get an update of this model with that number plugged in if that proposal came before us, but it still wouldn't help us with the overall kind of context of the things that we might want to do with this fund.
Again, I just want to go back. Shared information creates best shared decision making. And so that's what I'm encouraging, is that the committee have those conversations in a way that we all understand it in an equally set for decision making. And I get all of this. I mean, I understand the question, I would like to suggest that there be in the budget committee a discussion around what is our policy. We have a 16% policy for fund balance, but what is our policy for what limits are we going to set internally, externally, and how do we learn to do that within the industry perspective? So.
Okay, thank you.
This is anticlimactic because there's nothing different on this one.
I think we're at the general principle that's going to address these for every one of the funds we're going through.
Sure. So this just looks at the tourism 1 and 2 funds, and same analysis, same recession assumptions in 2021, 22. Same example. If we had an additional project of 100 million, this is how fund balance would be impacted. There's no sunsets on this fund to contemplate. It's straight occupancy and rental car. So.
Yeah, I want to say on this, this bucket in particular, I think we need to look at other purposes for this bucket as well. And that's why I asked the question about infrastructure versus programming, because our arts and cultural sector needs to be redefined as to what that is. I think we have a very narrow description that's been a legacy description for years and years, when in fact there's a lot of cultural things that we do fund that we might not be talking about, and how do we best use this fund to also look at not just the operating needs of these buildings, but of the arts and cultural ecosystem as a whole. And that's not really, that's really for council comment.
So just some key takeaways. Again, a reminder that tourism revenues can only be used for tourism, cultural, hospitality-related expenses. We have a strong financial position across all funds. The affordability analysis and scenario planning shows the ability to fund additional significant projects, and that we have flexibility and ability. And to Councilman Driggs' comment, we're really looking forward to some direction on which projects so that we can incorporate them in the model and have those next conversations. Hello.
Kelly, so one part that you did not show, and maybe it's not in your preview, is what is the revenue being? Oh, you can't hear me? Okay, all right. So Kelly, one item that you did not show, I think would be very important to council. What is the revenue generated from all the tourism events that take place? So everybody know my pet peeve, right? We lost the CIAA. And so they showed us 26 different events that makes up about $23 million in generation. I think for a lot of council members, we don't see the return on our investments that are generated from the tourism events they hold. Is that something you can share with us, or that's something we need to make a request from CRVA?
I think that's probably a combination of CRVA as well as our economic development team. I'm just looking at the revenues collected directly from hospitality, from room and board and rental car taxes. Those are the only two revenues that I'm contemplating in the model. But the economic impact is kind of outside my purview.
I agree with Mr. Mitchell. I think that we do need to have those folks come in and talk about that. Right. And I think that we shouldn't be looking just at economic impact. So if we have, I think, and I can't remember what's going on at CIAA and something else, there are like 2 or 3 major events. We ought to be able to look at spikes in the reporting. It's going to lag, but we ought to actually correlate events to actual receipts and changes. It might be a little bit historical, it may not be, but it's not the economic impact.
Right.
So I think that what Mr. Mitchell's getting at is that if we have a week of CIAA, and that's the only event that we had, and the state reports come back to us on room taxes, if we see the spike for that week, I think there is, help me, correlation? Yeah, correlation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that information probably comes from our hospitality partners as well. When we receive our receipts from the state, it's a monthly number. We could probably interpolate that some portion of it was dedicated to a week's event, but I think you can get that level of specificity from the hotel operators.
Okay. And the second question, if I can, for the last, and I'm going to say since I've been on council, we've always earmarked about $16 million to the CRVA from sales. where does that fund comes from?
Sorry, 60 million for what?
$60 million we earmarked for marketing and sales to the CRVA.
Oh, it's in, if you go back in your budget, it's much more specific, but it won't go backwards. If you look in the presentation, you'll see it, there's on that slide with the 3 boxes of the budget. You'll see in both the tourism and the convention center fund, CRVA fund, so there's 9 million for CRVA promotion and marketing in the convention center. There's 2.3 for CRVA business development.
Okay. so
All
that's-
in net, we give them about 27, you know.
Oh,
We
give
have a
them
loan
20
with them, they have a loan with us. It nets out to about 27 million in that 2019 directly to CRVA for all things, not just for programming, but for facilities, all of it.
$27 million we give
It
them.
was 27 and a half-ish, yeah.
And is that a policy that we set, or that's something?
So
who
in
set
the
that policy?
governing documents with CRVA, there, in each specific project has its own wrinkles to it. So Spectrum has some requirements as it relates to that facility and maintaining that facility, and we give all those dollars to CRVA. But as it regards to the CRVA promotions and operations, there is an agreement that says I don't want to quote the wrong number, but that every year we will increase that support by a percentage.
Okay.
And I don't want to make up the
And
percentage.
so is that a policy discussion among
It
council?
It is, I think, a contract discussion.
Right.
You know, if we didn't want to have a CRVA, we could just not approve a contract with them.
Right.
But I don't think that's where we're going. I think this is a discussion about what do you request, having their budget requests.
Right.
And in terms of some framework for it. And I think that, again, is one of those things that we can make a decision on, but it certainly is our contractual arrangement
Obligation,
with them.
right.
Yeah, I like kind of where this discussion is going, where Mayor Pro Tem and Councilmember Mitchell are kind of taking it. And I think we should find a way to have a discussion around CRVA. I think there's a bigger theme, a bigger picture there. What CRVA really does, and what these tourism dollars really do, is they go out and really build our brand of Charlotte. And that's literally like when we give them money to do that, we are trying to build our brand. And I think that we, the city council, need to take more control over controlling what our brand looks like. So when as the Mayor Pro Tem was saying, you know, what are we using those tourism dollars for? That, if you look back, it probably correlates to what people see us as a city being, that we are on level, we want these professional sports teams because we want to be a world-class city, and aren't really focusing on pushing, you know, the brand of being a cultural center with everything that is going on. So I think as we think about this, if we do decide to think about this, I really hope that we can think about it from a place of brand control, and seeing us as the stewards of that, and not another organization that we just give money to and hope that they align our brand where we want it to be.
Sounds like a great transition into the projects discussion.
And a great transition to the complexity of the issue. It's a lot. I think it is an appropriate review. I think we ought to always be questioning what's best, what's going forward. So I see that as a discussion. We can put that inside our contractual review and have that discussion. I think the branding discussion is much bigger because it includes a lot of people. So we'll have to figure that one out, but I think it's worth it. Okay, projects? Oh, I'm sorry.
So Kelly, if you look at slide number 5, if you go back to that sources and uses, so transfers under Convention Center Fund for $4.2 million.
That's the portion that the small cities get of the tax.
Who gets?
The smaller cities, towns, I guess, towns.
And same applies to others under tourism funds and NASCAR fund.
The other, so the transfer for 4.2 is the other cities. The other there is there's a subsidy to Bank of America Stadium for parking. They pay us revenue, it kind of nets itself out, and then we pay them back. Strange agreement. On the tourism side, The other is baseball stadium. There's about 800,000 in parking for baseball stadium, the BB&T stadium.
Got it. So
Uh,
this is just a general question around.
And real quick, the 4.3 on the NASCAR is the other reserve because there is a sunset on the occupancy tax as it relates to NASCAR. In that agreement, we agreed that we would set aside a reserve so that that operating cost for that system could continue on into perpetuity. So that's what that number is.
I like that we are being conservative in our modeling and forecast. So it was good to be conservative in forecast. My question is just general around CRVA. Does CRVA's operating budget, is it 100% funded from one of this, from this sources?
No, CRVA receives revenue from the conventions that it holds as well. So it gets revenue from that. I make up a number, I would say it's probably a 50-50 split, but they might get more from conventions than that. I don't have the number off the top of my head.
From conventions, like
From their actual events that they host.
Got it. And then operating costs like salaries and wages, that's all based from their entrepreneurial activity, which is convention center fees and total. Okay.
Yeah, I think much like our own budget, all the money lives in a pot together, in their
So is
enterprise fund.
Is our, I guess the funding they are getting from convention center fund, is it restricted to only certain activities, maybe marketing or sales, or is it just general fund for them?
Yeah, the same rules apply to them as that revenue. The revenue can only be used as the state legislation dictates. And the amount that we give them is based on the agreements for those specific projects. So when we're giving them the dollars, we know they're for facility maintenance of the Levine campus or whatever they're for.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
So, Mayor
One
and
member is
Council,
done.
As we transition from Kelly to Tracy, I think it's important to just put on the table that we have a very good relationship with the CEO of CRVA, Tom Murray, and as we are transitioning through trying to discern what is your desire for projects, we need to have that continuous collaboration at our level.
With the overview of the hospitality industry that makes it possible for us to get these things passed in the legislature.
So Mayor, I just want to make sure though, as we leave this, there were 4 or 5 takeaways from this conversation. So who is documenting those to make sure they
Okay.
occur?
Marcus has.
Yeah, we have
Yeah.
between me and
Okay.
Jason, and we'll confirm that before we leave.
And along those lines, if those lines are about what we captured, as you are having these discussions, if you have other things that you don't bring up, please make sure and capture them so we can get them, so we can at least make sure staff has them when we leave.
Great. So, as the manager said, we're going to do kind of a quick hit on some of the projects that are out there that we've talked about, that we hear about, things like that, just to kind of refresh everybody rather than what happens a lot of times as one-offs. He unfortunately took my first slide, which is we're really trying to come about this differently. We're trying to be more transparent with you.
This is at the Kings, that's at the Arbor Glen Center during the All-Star Game,
All-Star.
and they do a whole giveaway.
So the answer is no one knows who that player is.
Yeah, it is, buddy.
No.
Yeah, that's my idea, yeah.
Yes, buddy.
I've never heard of it.
You should.
I wanted to know about it.
That's right.
So, like I said, we're trying to go about this a little bit differently. We're trying to approach this as really partnerships. It's partnerships with the hospitality industry, as the mayor said, the CRVA, you guys, as well as our cultural and sports different entities, and then also really to collaborate on this. This is a process, and we want to try to be open about the process and bring everybody along, but it's fluid. So of the projects, I'm going to hit on the projects in the top half of the list, But what I really wanted to remind everybody is we've recently gone through quite a few other projects. Memorial Stadium, the link at Ovens, if anybody hasn't seen it lately, it looks really good. The Convention Center upgrade, the UNC Charlotte Conference Center, as well as Carolina Theater. So first, the Panthers. This picture is not meant to be indicative of their season, but did want to remind you all that we have. We did have. We have always anticipated a longer-term discussion with the Panthers. We had a 2013 agreement. As Kelly said earlier, that debt expires in 2023. But there were tethers associated with that 2013 agreement. So we anticipate, and this is before Tepper, this is before MLS, that come 2027 and 2028, that there is a bigger discussion that's gonna take place. And then the MLS component is a new piece to it. However, we all remember that there was an effort in 2016, and that in December we were awarded the team, and then the opening for the team is in 2021. I want to take this opportunity to be really clear about our steps and where we are in the process. We have a partnership, we have an alignment of a long-term goal to have the practice facility at Eastland, to discuss long and short term with the stadium, to understand better of what is this district around the stadium, what's going to happen, what does that want to look like. Those are all discussions, and those are a lot of different agreements that have to occur before we get to the 110 million. So I just want to reiterate that to everybody, that we are really in the beginning stages. Yes, we have the team. This is a little bit of an unusual process, but there's a lot still to work through. As it relates to timing, I think that you will see us tackle these things in that order. Eastland first, stadium short and long term will work with the district conversations, but Eastland is probably the one in the forefront first.
So Tracy, are you saying that we will know the terms of those next steps, including stadium, before we go unconditional on 110 million?
That is the goal that you, Mayor?
I just wanted, when you say stadium, because, I'm sorry, stadium, what does that mean? Sometimes people are thinking, is it a
You've got stadium and long-term up there, and that sort of
and
invites a question.
that's what I'm at. I
Yeah.
think, Tracy, when we say long-term and the stadium, what does that mean in this perspective?
I think for the purposes of this, it is that we have an agreed upon vision of what that's gonna mean. What is it that for the long term, what is it that we're talking about to keep the Panthers and MLS in Charlotte long term, beyond 2028, 2030? It's an agreed upon vision. I'm not insinuating that there's an agreed upon deal worked out for that, but that we have an agreed upon vision. I think if you go back and you think and you look at even what Tepper has talked about in the media, he's talked about a new stadium, he's talked about a dome stadium. We don't know what that long-term vision is yet, and that's what we're trying to get to as a part of this.
So I just wanted to say that personally, I regard the 110 million as being a down payment on a vision, a big vision that we have for cooperation with David Tepper. So if it was a question of paying that much just to get a soccer team, I would regard it as excessive. So I'm very interested to see what the terms are of other transactions that we might enter into to find out exactly kind of what the path is forward for us financially, because I assume it doesn't completely end there. The 110 million accomplishes the soccer part of the transaction and establishes the partnership. But if we get into entertainment district or any of the other kind of things that are just generally contemplated and a longer term relationship with the Panthers, then we're going to want to partner on other transactions as well. And now that we're in for 110 million on this first stage, I appreciate that the way this turned out was that we will know more about what other obligations we might have in order to realize the larger vision.
Yeah.
So
I want to, and want to just kind of go back to a thing that we've said all along is this is one big ball of yarn, and we can't let them get untied. And so that the timing of MLS came to us faster than I think we probably anticipated, and we had to start to form that partnership. But what we all agreed that we couldn't do is let these pieces unwind. We couldn't put you guys in a situation where we talk about MLS, we make a commitment, and then in 3 years we're talking about a different type of commitment. The intent was to keep it all wound together so that it is a bigger partnership that leads to more than just MLS or just Panthers, that it really was getting to all the things that Tepper said he wanted to achieve, and we want to.
So Tracy, I see the next steps. So what's the timeline for Eastland? When can council receive something in front of us?
So Eastland, the first step is going to be, the goal is that the first step is going to be the zoning. I would like to file the zoning in January. That will be, it is still the city property. The idea is that the zoning, though, is going to, if you file in January, you're looking at an April hearing at best, a May decision at best. In that same timeline, bring forward a development agreement that would work with the Panthers, that would also work with the master developer, Crosland. The development agreements are what's going to have all the details in them, not the zoning piece. The zoning piece stays relatively generic. The details are in the development agreement. So the goal would be early summer, the zoning decision with the development agreements are coming forward to you.
So Tracy, the development agreement, would that be just for Eastland, or are we also looking at stadium?
Yes, I can't reiterate enough. There are
Well-
multiple agreements.
So that all will be in May?
No, just Eastland, just Eastland.
Eastland
That's-
piece would be in May?
Yes.
How about the other agreement?
The other agreements that we'll still have to work through, we have to look at the existing 2013 agreement, what needs to be amended to that. Are there new agreements that need to be created around MLS? This is the stuff that we're just getting into now. But because of where Eastland is in the process, and because there is another part to Eastland, and this is just the anchor, that's where we're trying to move that one forward first.
I think it bears mentioning, especially given false information that makes its way out there, that while we have an urgency around accomplishing this multi-headed program and partnership, there is no dire need for everything to be solved today. There will be parts for each part of this, for the community to be engaged,
Absolutely.
for them to give us feedback, for us to make decisions in the light of day. And regardless of bad reporting, things that have placed that narrative out there, it couldn't be farther from the truth. And I think the community needs to understand that.
Second.
Yeah. So,
I don't think we.
are there any more questions about MLS before I move on? Okay, thank you. Amateur sports.
Can I say something?
Yes.
And going back to almost anything that we do, it's always better to upfront state what your principles are. And I want to say on MLS, we've committed to community engagement in the planning, which automatically makes it a lot longer. Because if we're going to do engagement, it's not sending out a postcard and saying, do you like MLS? It's like, what do you want surrounding, what are our commitments? And then the second thing that I think is that the timeline, again, if you remember, Vittner said, I can't remember what number one was, but he said in terms of economics for our city, that number two was Dave Tepper. Now, he didn't mean Dave Tepper with his shirts and jeans. He meant Dave Tepper as the ability to help finance a future like that we saw in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And I know that he has a lot of Pittsburgh people whispering in his ear all the time, but we need Charlotte whisperers to keep this thing on track. And I just want us to start thinking about that we commit to a citizen engagement process as one of our guiding principles, and that we commit that this is a partnership with Tepper Sports and the city of Charlotte around long-term goals for what I call the emerging sports industry, not just what we have today with the NFL, where are we going with esports, where are we going with all kinds of opportunities.
Yeah.
So those are the two things I think we ought at some point write down.
And Mary, you couldn't have said it better. Part of the discussion with them on achieving MLS was that there was the agreed upon and this alignment of vision that's already there is that MLS is bigger than the stadium. MLS is bigger than the stadium in Eastland. This is about the community and that it will have a larger community impact. So that's number one. There's a community benefits agreement that will be a part of this as well. So it's important that you mentioned that. And it is, I think that we are, as we look at this and what we have the opportunity with having somebody like Tepper in Charlotte, it is an opportunity. And I think we have this ability to really create something and build something great that's community-wide. Amateur sports. You guys have had multiple conversations over the years about an amateur sports facility. I think, and Kelly and I did not get the exact on this, but that the Convention Center Fund was tweaked to include indoor amateur sports at some point along the way. But that this has always been an interest and that we've looked at it and that it, I guess, continues to be an interest for council. The Convention Center future phase. So this is one that I think has just been continued to stay on the radar for everybody. You have what I call phase one underway, which is the construction inside the Convention Center right now. But what we always want to point out to you is everything up there in red has developed in this cycle. What's in green is a city-owned parcel, but trying to keep in the forefront in the mind of council and others is that the viability of the Convention Center, just keeping in mind that how do we keep the Convention Center viable? How do we keep it in the forefront so that it is competitive with the rest of the U.S. and other cities, but also reminding you all that there's one parcel that we own in close proximity to the existing convention center. So as we think about expansion or growth or things like parking, we just have to keep that in mind because it has been a dramatic change around there in this market cycle.
Hey, Tracy?
Yes.
We bought a quarter of a block of land from Duke Energy, I think with convention center funds. Is
We
that
have not
right, or
bought
is
that.
that city?
We have not bought that.
We haven't bought it? Because we were looking at it, right? We were talking at one point about, they said to us they had an idea for buying that land that was, and leasing it back to Duke Energy. I mean,
That was, I think, put on the table a couple of months ago, and right now, I think the manager, Tracy, will talk about that some more.
Yeah.
okay,
So-
so there's nothing there now, right now. Right.
Well, let me do a follow-up, because we had oh, okay.
So the Hornets, so now we're moving, all those projects that we just talked about were convention center fund projects. Now we're moving into tourism funds. I'm not just pushing between the buckets, just kind of lumping those two together. The Hornets and Spectrum Center, there's a 2005 agreement. That's when the arena opened. They have a non-relocation for 25 years. The lease expires in 2030. So we know, again, just like we think forward in this, that there will be some discussions over the next decade about the Hornets. There's also a piece in their agreement for CIP and capital improvements. Capital improvements were made in 2015, but as a part of that agreement in 2015, it said no other improvements or capital improvement requests for the arena could be made until 2021, but it said that it also starts negotiating in 2019. So we are just starting discussions with the Hornets and with CRVA about what that might look like. And that is, again, to keep the arena in a quality standard, and the agreements measure them against other specific arenas around the country.
Tracy?
Yes.
Can I ask that as a part of the negotiation? Line item number 1 is community usage of the facility, and that there's a reminder to the Hornets that the facility belongs to the citizens of Charlotte, and they manage it for us, but it's our building. And we'll talk offline about where that goes. Well, I don't think. Yeah, and we'll talk about bullets 1, 2, 3, and 4. But I think that's just needs to be clearly said and understood.
Okay.
So as Tracy goes through the last two slides, I do want to make sure that the mayor and council understand that all we're attempting to do right now is go over many of the items that have been discussed between today and 2016 in terms of particular projects. We will go into executive session to talk about negotiations around those projects, which is what we would not do in open session. So this is just a laundry list of the things that are out there, but we will have time to talk about negotiations around projects in executive session.
And I think as we've gone through those, to that point, if we've gone through these in the past, we talked about there was a list of projects, there was a list of projects. These are just, this is what's on the horizon, and this is what's out there, and I'm trying to give some context in these as to why and when. So we talk about, as Kelly's thinking about when things might come online, and they're related to agreements sometimes, or just different things that we know about the projects. Okay, Discovery Place. It's widely known that Discovery Place is looking at their viability. The facility was built in '81. IMAX was added in '91. They're looking at two different scenarios. One is a full demolition, and then another is a complete rehab of the existing facility. So they're in that process right now. We know it's out there. I think we've known that that was going on for a long time. And then lastly is Blumenthal. 2018 marked the 25th anniversary, and there has been a desire of Blumenthal to expand the lobby and actually bring the building more to the street and provide them some more event space, but as well as some conference space. And then we've looked at this as really a public-private project. How much can they raise privately to then what we look at as a public investment? So those are all the projects that I have. Any general questions?
Mr. Manager. So the tennis proposal hypothetically will fall into amateur sports, and we don't have to talk about the specifics, but I just want to kind of put it on the record.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
So I have a question. This was a good overview of all the tourism projects, but I would like to take a step further and look at the returns on investments for each one of these projects, and how does it help our local economy, jobs that it generates, and what are the community benefits for each one of these projects. I think that's an important part as we are making decisions on any of the tourism projects. We also have to include that.
So I think those are really good points. If you've got something that's a must-do to be included in the budget committee's work around looking at hospitality projects, please send me a quick text or an email saying. Now, my memory's not that good on sticky notes. My phone is much better. But if you get it somewhere, record it. So, but again, this is the idea that I think we were talking about the first time, combining financing with
The benefits together, so that we are looking at, so that we are looking at comprehensive picture. It's not just that here is the tourism bucket and here we are dispersing all the funds, but really what are the benefits and how we are looking at each project and scrutinizing it to make sure that we are meeting certain objectives for each one of these projects.
yes, as well as do we want to pay or should we pay
Right.
for the project? So that's what we'll be
So
doing.
it doesn't look like we are approving every request that comes through.
Obviously, we wouldn't
Yeah.
be able to afford that.
So as a little bit of a wrap up, that is why we have that before you today. When I first got here in December 2016, one of the criticisms was that projects would just come out of nowhere. And so we're trying to reestablish what's been in the hopper, do a deeper dive, and as the mayor said, what are the values around these? And as Kelly talked about prioritization, so I believe we're in a great place to level set this in a way that works for the council.
A quick question, Tracy. The amateur sports has been in the pipeline for years. So what exactly will kind of precipitate action on that? Or when are we going to schedule it?
Well, the amateur sports has gone a little bit differently. We've had a lot of different proposals come to us, So we vetted them, where are the sites, what is the viability of financing and things like that. We haven't gotten any lately. I mean, I think about a year ago I had several on my desk, but they just didn't quite make sense. When we get to an LOI stage, which is where we're trying to push these to, when we think that they're viable options, to bring to you then an LOI to then further discuss them. But it's been, amateur sports comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and a lot of different sites have been vetted. It's not like we're pushing one site or one location, and a lot of different types of proposals. So it's not one.
It looks like the economics were really good on that, like $650 a day in average revenues, and so it seemed like a kind of a low-hanging fruit thing, but it's just been out there for a long time.
It is, and I think it's about finding the right mix, the right location, all of those kind of things. Any other questions? Great.
Mayor, I have one.
Oh, wait a minute, Tracy.
Okay, just one last question. So, I'm not aware of any policy for any tourism project that comes in. How do we evaluate those, right? So, I think that's something council ought to discuss. Should we have a policy around tourism funds? And what should that policy look like? Should we assess it based on jobs, economic growth, returns on investments, community benefits? But I think having some sort of framework would help as we are seeing some of these requests come in, like what we ought to look at.
I think that's what the charge, we'll write that up in a formal charge to the Budget and Effective Government Committee. I think it covers the two things. One, what are our budget policies for that, as well as what is our policy around tourism. So I think that that's something that we'll send to committee, and we'll get that work done and come back to the full council. So yes, I think that's what we're looking for. I noted Budget Committee charge to develop principles around our hospitality projects, prioritization around the numbers and what goes through, and then looking at our funding principles and financial projections for what we can afford. All of that. Okay.
So
Do we
now
need a break?
we're gonna, yeah, you've been
We're
here
about
more than an
30
hour and a half. We're gonna take the one function break, if you will. We're gonna come back in, do our wrap up, and then we'll clear and do your closed session. So Katie's gonna put our 6 minutes on the clock. 6 minutes on the clock will be so the one function break. Larkin's going to hold me accountable, so he's not going to hold, no. He's given up on 6 minute breaks.
You have this one?
For fuck's sake. Huh? Yeah. I want you there too, though, because I don't want to do anything on camera. Not really. Let's talk about what the questions are. Oh, sorry. We're in the Cool Kids Club.